Eldarien rides into the city in the late afternoon, and after entrusting Fenarion to the stable master, walks to the temple. The streets are filled with anxiety, even fear, and she does not know why, but she also feels another emotion, which it takes her a large part of the walk to the center of the city to name: anger. Nothing appears amiss to her eyes, but her heart knows differently, and she is eager to speak with Cirion to hear the reason he called her home with such haste, and to learn the nature of whatever has stirred the citizens of Ristfand into such a state, if indeed these two are not one and the same. She ascends the steps of the temple compound with a tangible sense of homecoming, and pushes open the doors to the arched corridor of stone. Before turning to the right and making her way to Cirion's Redra, however, she steps into the vestibule of the temple and kneels on the floor for a moment. The long stone sanctuary is dark and cool, with light filtering in subtly from the high, clear windows along the nave and falling as a coloured array from the large stained glass in the apse, bathing the altar in an intermingling of light, colour and shape. When she comes to the Grandmaster's reception chamber, she finds the door slightly ajar and hears a raised voice from within. It is not Cirion's voice, but one she recognizes yet cannot name. Taking a step away so as not to eavesdrop unintentionally, she rests her back against the wall and waits. But despite her efforts, the voice rises again for a moment, clearly in anger, and she hears the words,
"You will be the downfall of us all, Cirion. Those of our members who sided with the rebellion need to be expelled from the temple. There is no place for lawlessness in our midst."
Eldarien does not hear Cirion's reply to this accusation, but the voice grows quiet, and before long a person emerges from the chamber, red-faced, and passes by her with hardly a glance. She recognizes his face, but knows not his name, a man of late middle age, a noble of the city. She knocks on the door, still ajar, and it swings open a couple inches by itself, creaking on its hinges. Cirion looks up and smiles.
"Ah, Eldarien, please come in. I trust you had a safe journey."
She steps into the room and takes a seat before Cirion at the welcoming gesture of his hand. The room is well lit, not only with lanterns hanging from the walls and a reading lamp on the table behind which Cirion sits, but with tall arched windows behind him, lightly curtained with white cloth, though still allowing the golden rays of the fading daylight to filter in. The walls are lined with bookshelves, appearing messy and unkempt, but actually orderly, and racks of ancient scrolls tied simply with cloth or leather, or protected by tubes of metal. A small statue of the goddess stands in the corner, as if resting in the dancing light of sun and flame.
"I did have a safe journey."
Eldarien replies,
"And pleasant. Fenarion is a good and docile horse."
"And how fares your family?"
"They are well, and we were all glad to see one another and to be together."
"But saddened at the shortness of your stay?"
Cirion asks perceptively,
"That is so, but under the sadness remains gladness. They know and understand as much as they may at present."
"You appear to have something else on your mind, Eldarien."
Cirion says, looking at her with a glimmer in his eyes and running his hand through his long white beard.
"What is it?"
"You have called me here for a reason,"
she replies.
"Surely that is a more pressing matter."
"It is pressing indeed, but not so pressing that I cannot hear from you what is upon your heart. Recall what I told you not so long ago, when we last parted. Forget not yourself, in the midst of your desire to care for others, for only from the fullness of your heart can you also give in abundance and with true tenderness and love."
He chuckles softly.
Those were not my exact words, I expect, but the meaning was similar.
"But if we hold back from love, clinging to ourselves in possessiveness and refusing others' heart and act, then care for self becomes nothing but a lie. An act of selfishness which leads to isolation, not the fellowship to which we are called."
Elmarie says.
That is true,
Syrian admits.
but that is not the danger which you face at present, my dear. You incline more to forgetting that you have burdens and cares of your own in your eagerness to carry the burdens of others.
In a certain sense, aren't they so deeply united that they cannot be extracted from one another?
She asks.
Yes and no. The suffering of each man is his own, unlike that of any other. This is true. But what you say is even more true without negating the first. The suffering of every man belongs to every other, and all we bear indeed, all we bear both of pain and of joy, reverberates in the heart of every other. This you have learned well and will learn still more deeply. And I believe it shall be of great importance for yourself and for many others before the end.
Syrian pauses and leans forward, a gentle smile on his face and the light behind him glowing in his hair.
But please, what is it that you carry with you as you return? Tell me if you wish, and then we can turn to the other matter.
I do wish.
Elmarie answers, and she relays to Syrian the conversation that she shared with her parents on the morning of her departure from Telonis. She shows him the ring, and he inspects it with attention before handing it back to her. She slips it back onto her finger and finishes her account. After she has concluded, he replies,
I am sorry that you did not know of this until so many years into your life. As for the riddle of your origin, of your family, perhaps light may be shed upon it yet. I wish I had known about it long before this, but then again, that would have set my intentions against those of your parents. So perhaps the way things unfolded was indeed best. Though I wish they would have told you when you were younger.
A part of me would wish for the same.
Elmarie says.
But I am content. When I reflect upon it, I would not really have it any other way than it has been.
I understand what you mean,
says Syrian.
But as for the future, I would like to look into the designs upon that ring, which I have noted in my mind, though I may ask to see it again to discover if we can trace its origin. That is, if such a path is your wish.
It is.
Elmarie replies after a moment's thought.
Very good,
Syrian says, and then pausing and sighing deeply, he shifts in his chair.
But now we must speak of something both grave and pressing, for which I called you here.
What is it?
Only days ago there was an uprising in the ghetto, having long fermented in the silence, and now finally bursting forth. And it was not just vocal complaint or the call for justice. No, it was an uprising in arms, aimed toward bloodshed. I do not understand exactly what they intended with this, but the attack, at least in hindsight, had little hope of complete success. For them, I think, it is meant to be but the beginning. However, I fear that they shall call down on their heads, and indeed upon all of us, the wrath of the Empire.
So you have called me here too?
Elmarie falters as the images of death flood her mind's eye.
I have called you here to treat those who are wounded and to comfort those who have lost the people dear to them.
Syrian says.
But I warn you, it is a dangerous task, as the Empire has eyes that would gladly crush any who appear to side with the rebellion.
But we are servants of the goddess and members of the temple.
Elmarie exclaims.
Certainly they would only expect us to do as her teachings indicate.
I hope that you are right, and that is what I am counting on, though the danger remains. Are you willing?
More than willing.
Of course.
But tell me,
Elmarie begins.
what sparked this action? And how many people were involved? Was it only certain persons in the ghetto, or was it a wider movement?
So many questions.
Syrian responds, raising his hands.
But I understand your desire for answers and your pain. All shall become clear in time. Let this answer suffice for now. This was a plan long conceived by the underground resistance operating in Ristfand and a concerted effort of rich and poor alike. insofar as fraternal cooperation between them is feasible at all. It may have even been instigated from the leadership in Minstead. Indeed, I believe that is the case. That is the answer. But as I speak, another comes to mind, which I shall also give. The goal of this rebellion was to overthrow imperial control in the city and to give sovereignty back to the people of Telmerion and the rulers of the Rovers clan.
The Heres is a part of this movement?
Asks Eldarien.
At this point we do not know.
Cirion replies.
We know not whether he was cooperating behind the scenes or whether the rebels intended to supplant him and establish a new clan leader. As I said, I trust that all will become clear with time, but for now, all we can do is act to relieve the suffering of the victims of the conflict.
You answered more than you said you would.
Eldarien says.
Thank you for that. I will try not to worry unduly. What would you have me do now?
Cirion rises from his chair and walks around the table to Eldarien and takes her hands in his own, looking at her with deep kindness in his eyes. The light through the window is now growing dim as twilight deepens into night.
I would have you rest and be at peace,
he says softly.
For tonight, try to settle into your new home again and sleep. Tomorrow I will go with you to the ghetto and we will see what more may be done. I have been already, as have others, but it shall be your first time since the conflict, and I wish to be with you.
With that he bids her good night, and she turns to go, shutting the door to the Radra quietly behind her. The corridors are silent, and her footstep lightly echo against the stone as she walks to her bedchamber, untouched since she was last in Ristfand. It is a small room, 8 by 10 feet, with a paned window against one wall, looking out into a forested courtyard, though now veiled by a heavy curtain. There is a low bed, only a plank of wood on stilts with a straw mattress, and a side table next to it on which are a washbowl and towel. On the wall opposite the bed is a table littered with books, with paper for writing, ink and a quill, and a glass lantern with a long wick steeped in oil. Tucked under the table is a rickety old wooden chair that creaks when its sitter moves. Eldarien sits down on her bed and pulls her pack from her shoulders, dropping it softly to the floor. She then slides a wooden crate from underneath the bed and opens it. It functions as a dresser and wardrobe, and she arranges the clothing from her pack into it, before putting the pack itself in it as well and returning it to its place under the bed. Then she leans her elbows against her knees and rests her forehead against her hands. She closes her eyes and lets out a deep breath. Is this the path that has been prepared for her, to care for the victims of warfare and violence? She allows this question to linger silently in her heart as she listens for the voice that speaks deeper than words. She feels afraid, not only of her own inadequacy, her own inability to help these people as they need, but also of the proximity to such intense suffering and loss. She has felt the pain even at a distance, and she can only imagine what it shall be like to touch it, to embrace it, to step beyond every veil and to be as close as possible in body to the people to whom her heart has long been close in spirit. But she knows too that she, in fact, desires nothing else than this, and has long desired precisely this movement. But as it comes to it, she is scared. She is scared, too, at the manner of the suffering and what it bodes for the future. Of all the forms of suffering that can be inflicted on a nation, war is perhaps the worst, the most all-pervading and the most difficult to remedy. She leans into prayer and lets these anxieties and fears fall away from her, or rather lets herself fall, in all that she is and feels, into the warm embrace of the love that holds her and carries her. And as she does so, her spirit finds rest, and her mind eases off of the thoughts born of anxious fear. Instead, she is carried back to the time she spent in Telonis, to the faces of her mother and father and siblings, to the wedding of her friends, to the stars glistening and dancing in the night sky. She recalls the conversation she had with her parents on the morning of her departure, both their tenderness and care, as well as the pain she felt at realizing that the truth had been withheld from her for so many years. She is not angry with them, as she understands that they acted only out of concern for her, and once the secret was revealed, shared with her freely all that they could. The love in their eyes as they spoke to her, almost as if they would find out the truth of her past and give it to her, were such a thing possible, moves her deeply now. With a surge of gratitude, she rests with the eyes of her heart upon their faces, absent-mindedly touching the ring upon her finger. Then the image of her parents' faces gives way to the face of Cirion, her father in spirit, and she sees a similar love and tenderness in his gaze, though more profound, because more deeply rooted. She remembers his face as he inspected the ring taken from the body of her mother and his words. Hope rises within her and desire that it may indeed be possible to learn something of her origin, something of the woman from whose womb she was born, and of the man from whom she was sired. But then again, even if she never learns, it is little loss, for she has a home already, 2 homes in fact, and even one is already more than many have, and more than many more will have, if the war indeed progresses, robbing numerous children of their parents and turning them into orphans. And thus her most intimate personal thoughts and desires lead her again, full circle, to concern and compassion for others. And in her mind and heart, it is as if the two blend together. What is most intimate to her, and what is most intimate to others, while remaining distinct, like 2 lungs in a single body, or like blood flowing in and out from differing limbs into a single heart, a heart that is her own but also more than her own, a heart that holds her most deeply just as, in her heart, she desires to hold others. In mid-morning, Cirion accompanies Eldarien through the streets of Ristfand, already noisy with sellers at their market stalls trying to barter their wares, and children playing in alleyways or the grass in front of houses. At least the laughter and play of children are still to be heard, and the rumbling of carts or the clopping of horses' hooves against the cobbled stones as they make their way out of the city for the day's labour. The city goes about its business as usual, though Eldarien knows that something has changed and that the normalcy of the daily routine conceals a fear and an expectation in the hearts of the people. The slums are on the northeast side of the city, in a section surrounded by a high wooden wall of rough-hewn beams lined vertically from the earth to 8 feet in height. There are 2 entrances from the west and from the south, from the Bayer Road and the Hrila Road, respectively.
It looks quite different on the inside than the last time you were here.
Cirion warns as they come to the southern entrance.
Are you prepared?
Yes.
Very well.
With this, they continue through the gateway, about 10 feet wide, and follow the road into the ghetto. They are greeted immediately by stains of blood against wood and stone, wall and ground, and Eldarien stifles a gasp.
Many men stood in this place, as at the western gate, and tried to hold back the imperial soldiers who sought to enter the ghetto.
Cirion says.
What exactly were these men attempting?
Asks Eldarien.
And why did they begin in the slums?
As I said, their plans in full are more than I can know. But what they have achieved of their plan is clear. They have slain the Imperial Councillor in cold blood and fought back the forces that were sent to punish them for their crime, though I expect that such was precisely their original intention.
What do you mean?
I mean that the manner of their attack on the Councillor was intended,
Explains Cirion.
Precisely to provoke battle with the forces of the Empire who occupy Ristfand. It was meant as an explicit declaration of war, a challenge to the Empire to bring warfare to the east. It seems that the rebel forces have grown tired of this stalemate and wish to exert more influence, with bloodshed, to bring this conflict to a conclusion.
How did they attack the councillor?
Asks Eldarien.
They attacked him publicly on his monthly visitation.
And they hope to repel the imperial wrath with the small amount of forces at their disposal.
I said that the imperial response put an end to their rebellious activity. That is true in part. But I think there is more to it than that.
Syrian says.
It may appear that the rebellion in the city was crushed, but it only retreated, like a snake with many heads that, losing one, shall simply emerge at an opportune time to strike again. But let us forget about these matters now. The course of the world is not ultimately determined by politics nor by war, but by the humble and hidden fidelity of ordinary hearts and lives. So let us go to the people suffering under the former and encourage them in the latter.
The ghetto has always felt almost like a different city than the rest of Ristfand, with houses made of wood and scrap cramped together in muddy streets smelling of sewage with little grass, trees, or vegetation of any kind. Home to many who have fallen through the cracks of the commerce of Ristfand, or who, for one reason or another, lost the means to support themselves and had no one else to care for them. The population in the ghetto is more dense than anywhere else in the city. There are also many persons whose livelihood has been lost or who have found themselves in the ghetto simply because of prolonged illness, whether physical or mental in nature. A large hospital stands almost precisely in the center of the ghetto, a long building with a low roof, the sole structure with stone walls in the entire ghetto. It was built almost 100 years ago by members of the Temple of Neraniel with the permission of the government of Ristfand, and has been tended by them, among other volunteers, ever since. Syrian leads Eldarien there now, and as they step in through the threshold, she immediately hears the cries of those with grave physical wounds and sees pallets lined close together against the walls on either side, with mostly men and a few women resting upon them.
We shall do for these people the little we can,
Syrian says.
The city refuses medical aid to those who participated in the rebellion, but the temple has secretly requested aid and supplies from the people, and we have received a vigorous enough response in medicine, bandages, and tools. Our presence and work here can make a great difference in these people's lives and can relieve much of their suffering. But be aware that there are some for whom this hospital is now not a place of recuperation, but a hospice in which they prepare for their final departure in death.
They then go among the citizens, tending to their wounds, bringing them water and nourishment, or simply sitting with them for a while, speaking or listening or holding their hands in silence. Eldarien feels the heavy air that permeates the hospital, and at first she struggles to breathe, feeling oppressed by the weight of human suffering, by the fear of death, by the anger and resentment and a host of other emotions that surge like currents of water, ripples cast from the many hearts in the building, like a lake dammed up within four walls and churning with tumultuous waters. But as she goes among the persons, engaged in the simple activities that she can perform, or listening and speaking in the little way she can, Eldarien begins to feel another reality underneath the oppressive suffocation. She feels a sense of hope, of courage, and of longing. It is not her own sense, however. No, it belongs to the people, whose aspiration for freedom, so apparently crushed, nonetheless blossoms anew like a rose after winter and reaches out toward the sun of new life, whether it shall come in this life or only in the place that lies beyond death. These two realities, fear and longing, mingle together within the hospital and within Elmarien's own heart, and she feels the conflict, the tension between them. What can overcome this duality, this conflict between fear and desire, between the reaching out for definitive life and the ultimate futility of such an aspiration? For the desire for life is thwarted by death. And what lies beyond death? Is it more death, a shadow of one's previous life, or something more? But how? How can a dying heart take solace in what awaits when it remains unknown, undisclosed, and could be even worse than the sufferings preceding it? No, Eldarien feels her heart protest. There is a hope deeper than the fear, and a knowledge deeper than the uncertainty, a light deeper than the deepest darkness. And in this alone, she takes comfort and solace, and finds strength to hope for these suffering hearts, just as she does for her own. For there is, as she has been taught and as she believes, a dawn that will come to end every night. A month and a half passes, and Eldarien finds herself settling into a routine. In the early morning, she spends a few hours in the temple, drinking in the silence of ancient stone as the day turns from darkness to light and the rising sun shines in through the stained glass window, bringing color to the colorless shadows. She joins in the temple services, of course, and they are precious to her, morning, midday, evening, and night. But the times that are nearest to her heart are the times in silence, in solitude, when no one else is in the temple but her. During these times, the air itself vibrates with the sound of silence, the light itself shines with rays invisible, and the solidity of earth, stone, and wood feels as if unmovable even by 1,000 ages of the world, and yet feels as if passing in a single instant, only to give way to that life which is enduring. During the daytime hours, Eldarien is in the ghetto, usually in the hospital tending to the ill and wounded, though during her time here she witnesses many persons die and many recover. Because of this, the densely crowded room eventually empties again, except for about 12 persons. Toward one woman in particular, Eldarien feels a special bond, a particular affection, and also a deeper pain. Teliana is only a few years older than Eldarien herself, a wife and mother of 2 children, though both her husband and her children have died as a result of the conflict. Her husband, Alsenor, was slain at the western gate and died almost instantly, with a lance through his heart. But he was known to the captain of the Imperial Guard, having had dealings with him in the past. Thus, as the conflict began to settle and the fires of battle died down, he sent 2 men to the house of Teliana's husband and arrested both her and her 2 children. What they feared of a widow and her 2 small children, Eldarien does not know. But perhaps it was not fear that drove her captors, but desire, the desire for vengeance against one who was already dead, and yet whose crime they wished to see punished to the fullest extent of their power. And this happened even beyond their own control, as both of Teliana's children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 3, became sick themselves. This was due to the conditions in the overcrowded prison, filled with the stench and infection of numerous wounded persons left untreated, and despite the care that Teliana gave them, they died in the prison cell in the arms of their mother. She became sick shortly afterwards, and one of the guards, who had previously arrested her, was moved with pity and petitioned for her to be released. And so she was, but the illness had already taken hold. She thus moved from incarceration in a prison that felt like a hospital for the dying to a hospital for the dying that felt like a prison. But there was a difference. In the prison there were bars and harshness and apathy, while in the hospital there was love and care and compassion. Perhaps she was already beyond treatment, and regardless of whether there were bars or not, she could not leave. But this is where Eldarien found her, with a broken spirit and a grieving heart, dying of an illness that was more of the spirit than it was of the flesh. She gave Teliana what treatment she could, draughts of herbs to reduce her fever and to quell any infection she may have, food and water that she could digest, and a friend at her side as often as she could spare. She bathed her too, and cleaned her when she soiled herself, since she could not even rise from her pallet on her own, so weak was she. At first, Tiliana was embarrassed by all of this, by her bodily vulnerability, but also simply by her complete incapacity, and apologized frequently in her frail voice. But Eldarien would simply run her hands through Tiliana's long blonde hair, now matted with sweat and tears, and assure her again and again that she was glad to offer this service and any other that she could provide.
My husband was so concerned for us,
She said one day as Eldarien fed her small spoonfuls of broth.
He knew that standing up against the Empire would endanger us, and he said that he had compromised with them for so long precisely because he wanted to protect us. You see, he was a government officer in the past. We were of a noble family, as noble as one can be in Telmerion, where we have no class distinctions between noble and commoner. For generations, the men in my father's line were counselors to the Harassy and their guards as well. This brought many favours and protections, but it also involved them deeply with the imperial councillor, whose role mirrored their own, but, sadly, was given priority simply through the treaty that granted the Harassy to remain in power as long as they acted always in cooperation with the councillor appointed to them by the Empire.
So he was, in a sense, supplanted from his role.
Eldarien asks.
You could say that, I suppose, but it is not as if he had no influence.
Says Tiliana.
He was just forced to continually butt heads with the councillor who was his rival. And eventually, Alsenor decided that he had enough of it and chose to retire from his position.
She falls silent, exhausted from the effort of speech, and all is quiet for a long while as she eats slowly what Eldarien gives to her. Eventually she speaks again, and there is earnestness in her voice.
But he had to stand up, you see. He could not just stand by idly when he saw the blatant betrayal of truth and good unfolding before his very eyes. He tried to work against this betrayal from within, but at last...
Sensing that she's not going to say more at the moment, Eldarien assures her.
I understand as much as I can why he did what he did.
I don't regret it.
Tiliana sighs.
I just wish that.
Her voice fades, and tears form in her eyes, and escape to roll silently down her feverish cheeks.
You wish that your children had been spared.
Eldarien concludes for her.
Yes. Beta. Enanar.
Tiliana breathes, invoking her children's names with a grief, love, and reverence that breaks Elmarien's heart. Then she looks up into Elmarien's face and says,
I only wish to join now those whom I have lost.
Eldarien begins, but her voice catches in her throat.
You're going to say that you want me to live, right?
Tiliana asks.
But why? For myself? To fight the injustice that robbed me of my family? No, I am not interested in that.
You are my friend, Tiliana.
Eldarien says, finding her voice again.
Whether you live or die matters little to me, though of course my heart will grieve at your loss. What I care about is that you walk the path intended for you, whatever that may be.
Tiliana stares at Eldarien, surprised by her words, and their eyes interlock for a long moment. At last she says,
Your words are not what I expected.
What else am I supposed to say?
Asks Eldarien.
That I wish you to live for my sake.
To be honest,
Tiliana begins.
I think that, if you asked, I would be able to do that.
I cannot ask that of you.
Says Eldarien.
You must look deep within yourself to discover if you still carry within you the spark of life. For if you do, this spark can again become a flame. If not, were you to choose to live simply because I have asked it of you, there would be no spark to sustain you, and such life would not last.
What do you mean?
You must find deep within yourself the desire to live. And perhaps this desire is beyond you, but you may still find a calling, a voice echoing within you, inviting you to rediscover the courage to live. Without this desire and this voice, what good would my voice do for you?
Perhaps your voice, Eldarien, precisely your voice, is what I needed.
Tiliana says,
You have given me permission both to grieve, even unto death, as well as to heal, to accept the pain, and to walk back unto life.
I wish only that you walk unto life, my friend.
says Eldarien, taking Tiliana's hands within her own.
Wherever that may lead. Let hope alone be your guide and not despair. For hope is the only road along which a person may walk and not come to grief, even if grief marks the journey.